Good evening, everybody. I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning here at the University of Sydney and also Director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust. And before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge the first planners, actually, of this country, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is where the University of Sydney's campuses stand and where I have the privilege of living and working. And I pay my respects to those elders and the traditional owners, as well as elders past, present and emerging. And I recognise their ongoing leadership and custodianship of country. And of course, with National Reconciliation Week last week, it's also timely to remind ourselves those words from last week. Now more than ever is actually the time to commit to rectifying past injustices, particularly in the land and planning space, and commit to resolving those in favour of full recognition, justice and reconciliation in the future. So, look, welcome. What a lovely evening to be here today for an absolutely fantastic celebration of the book Planning Better Cities. I want to say very briefly something about the Henry Halloran Research Trust, as well as our co-partners for tonight's event, the PA Young Planners Association, before I hand over to the actual chair, Dr. Pranita Shrestha. So the Henry Halloran Research Trust is a multi-disciplinary research centre set up at the University of Sydney nearly 10 years ago now, thanks to the generous donation of Warren Halloran, in recognition of his father, who was a visionary and kind of rambunctious town planner, but believed very much in the value of good town planning and in the need for connections between sort of research activities, knowledge generation at universities, and dialogue and evidence-informed practice, which is kind of, I think, something that we all here tonight are very much in favour of, and it's very much the type of work that Halvard has done in his book. I have to acknowledge the first director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust, because he's in the room, our real celebrity here, Professor Emeritus Peter Bibbs. So thanks for joining us. But one of the things that the Henry Halloran Trust does amongst the different research projects that we sponsor and public events such as the Festival of Urbanism that we love to hold, which brings together academics from across our university and other universities with research, with practitioners, with policymakers, with community advocates. But one of the things that we also do is host practitioners in residence here at the university, and we at the university gain a great deal from those practitioners, one of whom was, of course, Halvard Dalheim, and one of our current practitioners, who will be introduced later, is Viva, sitting next to Halvard. But this book was one of the things that Halvard worked on in part during his period here as a practitioner in residence. Now, second, I have to explain that we are co-hosting tonight's event with the PA Young Planners Association, although I like to think of you as the New Planners Association, I have to say, even though our speaker tonight, our emissary from the Young Planners, is actually, well, you do look outrageously young, Henry. but anyway, I'm not introducing Henry. Pranita's going to introduce you, but when she does, you are really going to think that he is outrageously young for the list of accomplishments that I can see on the page. But look, the New South Wales Young Planners is a committee that's established by the New South Wales Division of the Planning Institute of Australia. Fantastic institute, actually had a fantastic event last night on density and transit-oriented development. Anyway, as the next generation of planners, the New South Wales Young Planners aim to provide student and young professional or new professional members of the Planning Institute with opportunities to learn more about planning and through professional development programs, social networking events and mentoring programs, and more besides. So those of you who are new planners and student planners, obviously the message is join the Young Planners Association. They do fabulous things. And now my last duty is to introduce Dr. Pranita Shrestha, who is chairing the event tonight. And Dr. Shrestha also looks ridiculously young, because I'm not going to read her full bio, it's pretty extensive, but she is actually our latest recruit here in the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, where I moonlight 2 days a week. Pranita is our latest lecturer in urbanism. She is absolutely a passionate educator, researcher, practitioner. She's got extensive experience across urban planning and design, with an architecture and planning degree. Of course, her key areas of research expertise, and I have had the privilege of working with Pranita for many years on an ARC research project, and she uses her very strong theoretical skills in social network analysis to understand and address inequality in land and housing systems, which is really what her research and teaching practice has all been about, informed by her experience across both the so-called global south and the north. And look, she has researched across Europe, Asia, Africa and Australia, and also worked as a practitioner across those different contexts as well. And she was formerly Program Director for Masters of Urbanism students here. Lucky us. And with that, I'm handing over to Pranita.
Thank you, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be chairing this very important event. And I had the privilege and opportunity to meet Halvard when he was a practitioner in residence for Halloran Trust. And and he was invited to teach into our strategic planning capstone unit. And the students were just mesmerized because it was like an icon coming and teaching you about strategic planning, and he did a fantastic job. I think some of the students are sitting as the audience there who know how passionate he's about strategic planning, and I think it's a privilege to be hosting this session today. I'd like to shout out to the new graduates in the room, like new planners, and invite you to have a look at the book, buy the book, read the book. And if you this is a QR code just for you to get discount on the book. And it's a fantastic guide to strategic planning. I'd like to introduce Halvard and also panelists today. We've got, of course, Dr. Halvard Dalheim. Halvard is a master's qualified and an award-winning city and regional planner with extensive experience in metropolitan and regional planning, having led multiple plans for Melbourne and Greater Sydney, including the latest metropolitan plan for Greater Sydney, a metropolis for 3 cities. His experience spans over 3 decades and includes significant periods in state and local government and the private sector. And I'd also like to include that he's a fantastic teacher. I think he's very, very good with the students, and his passion shows with and our studios are run 8 hours, so he can talk strategic planning for 8 hours. So that's how passionate he is about strategic planning. And these are like whole day, so it was amazing to see him sort of engage with the students. And our next, also a privilege to be welcoming Viva Megnan, who is a graduate from our Bachelor's of Architecture and Environment, and also a graduate from our Masters of Urban and Regional Planning. So I've actually had the opportunity to teach her 2 times in her undergraduate and a little bit in her postgraduate. So Viva is an urban planner and a policy professional with over 4 years of experience. Proud, very proud. That is what we want our students to achieve. across both the public and private sector. She holds a Masters of Urbanism, Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Sydney, and has experience in a range of policy areas, including housing and sustainability. Viva is currently a planning officer at the New South Wales Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, where she's focused on strategic planning. That's the reason you are in part of the panel, to support positive outcomes across Greater Sydney and New South Wales. She's also currently practitioner in residence for Henry Halloran Trust. Our next panelist, and privileged to welcome Stephanie Baker, who has over 25 years experience in strategic planning across the public and private sector. She specializes in urban structures, housing, economic development, and infrastructure, working across 3 levels of government. In her recent role at the Greater Cities Commission, Stephanie was responsible for strategic planning for the region spanning Greater Sydney, Lower Hunter, Central Coast, and Illawarra, which covers a quarter of Australia's population. It's a pleasure to have you in the panel. And last but not the least, I think Henry Black is an up-and-coming professional with a passion for combining planning with property development. In local and international contexts. He is starting a master's in planning at Harvard University and has studied in Australia, the United States, and China. Very interesting. We would like to hear more, but at some other time, as part of his undergraduate degree. He also has experience in all spheres of planning, working at Department of Planning, Randwick City Council, etc., a number of property development consultancy, and he was New South Wales Young Planners of the Year for 2023. Yes, welcome. And I'd like to begin by requesting Halvard to say a few words and read his book.
Okay.
Would you like this?
No, I should be able to speak loud enough, I think. Yeah. So can everyone hear me at the back? Gargi? Okay, sorry. Okay, can do. So it's been a little bit of a journey to get here. And so I think even though I'd like to cover a couple of things, and a couple of my students now actually took some notes with me today. I don't normally have notes with me. But there's a few people I'd like to acknowledge. First, my first employer, Jeff Walensky, who put me on the path of strategic planning, which was partly by accident. You apply for a job and you end up having to be somewhere, and you find out on your business card it says you're a strategic planner, so okay, I'm a strategic planner. But he also was my boss for 11 years, and he's still my mentor, and it's through Jeff that I actually learned about really how cities work, how cities tick, and put me on the path of learning, which was the main thing that Jeff did. I'd then also like to thank a few people in terms of getting this book off the ground, in terms of addition to Jeff. First, Marcus Spiller, who I did some initial notes. The initial notes, if you look in the book, there's over 100 insights in the chapters. That's what I first wrote. And then when Marcus had a look at that, he said, you've got to keep thinking about this, you've got to keep doing this. That bubbled along for a fair amount of time, and it wasn't till really when COVID came and I decided to start a business right at the right time when everything shut down, that this gentleman over here, Peter Phibbs, said, we can support you. And the main part of the support was actually through a person called Michael Bounds, who was really, really fantastic. And Viva's going to be working with Michael in terms of, so who's your audience? I mean, you've written something that's very interesting for yourself. Is anyone else going to be interested in this? So he worked with me for a good period of time in turning what were basically a whole lot of thoughts into what is a structured book, and I'm very grateful to him for that. There's been a couple of other people on the way, naturally my publishers, so Rachel Ballard, Connie Lee, and Nandakini Lowry. I learnt a little bit about. Connie's in China, Nandakini's in India, and Rachel is in London. So working across all those different time zones was quite interesting for me as a learning experience. There's also a few people on the way that have helped. The book has, I think, a reasonable outline of First Nation issues. And for that, Ellie Davidson provided support. She critiqued all the work that I'd done and added some bits, and that was really the result, again, of Peter over there giving me the direction to actually do that. Also, this lady over here, Tara, Tara Madden. Tara, many people in planning would know Tara. She is a fantastic editor, and she edited the book and she managed to delete 10,000 words, literally. And when I was looking at Tara's work, you sort of go, okay, you can't take six words out of a sentence because it doesn't make any sense. And then you read it and you go, well, actually it does. But the part I don't really understand is the speed that Tara does it, because it's just going through, and it's a fantastic part. So also a lady, Leanne Terrington, who actually typed my first draft, and she worked for me at the City of Casey. Then I think there's a group of people, when I first started teaching in Pranita's class and in Adrian's class, I was able to not talk to the students about my book, and I found it was a very different task of actually trying to pass on the knowledge rather than just actually writing it down. So that was really helpful in terms of putting that together. Then from today, Nicole, Linda and Greta in terms of making today happen. And of course, Brenda. So okay, that's that part of that part done. So in terms of the book, I thought there were suggestions that I should actually read a bit. I might read a little bit, but I thought I would talk about, the book actually is in 3 parts, and the 3 parts are really quite important in terms of how the book can be absorbed. The main part is part 2, which is the ABC, or Strategic Planning 101, in terms of what to do. In one sense, it's not rocket science, but when you go through it all, it actually is quite detailed and quite in-depth. I've written it from the point of view that you don't know what to do and you're starting a journey and someone has just told you have to do a plan. So I've actually written every step of the way, how to deal with ministers, how you do engagement, how you deal with First Nations questions, how you do research, what synthesis is about, and that's the hardest thing to teach, because synthesis needs a different type of thinking. And so goes all the way through to the end in terms of having a final plan, but also then passing on to the people who deliver it. So that's part 2 about how to do it. The first part is sort of, if you're going to go on the journey, there's a couple of things you need to just recognise about cities. And so the first part is really that, in terms of understanding how city planning has evolved, but also what the purpose of planning is and what it's about and its purpose. And they're 2 quite different things. So that's part 2. Part 3, I'm actually probably most proud about, in that when I was writing the book and I got up to the research and analysis section, I'm going, we actually don't have a pattern book in planning. There's actually nothing that says what you should actually research. So I did quite a bit of research, looked at, there's some work from America and looked at all the capital city plans in Australia, looked at Vancouver, Toronto, New York, London, and there's no clear what do you do. So I sat down and actually tried to have a go at that. So that's one of the things I'm probably quite proud of, is putting in place a pattern book. In the end, it's structured in 3 parts, and there's 12 research areas and 42 research topics, and you can't change that because that's the meaning of life. So that it's not as though I'm saying to everyone, you always have to study 42 things. What I'm actually saying is you need to think about the 42 and which ones you need to study. And that I think is something that we've never had before, because I just realised myself I've never done that before. So part 3 is a full explanation of each of those 42. We go through in depth what it's about, not in terms of exactly how to do it, but one of the things in terms of my job as a strategic planner, I call myself a specialist at being a generalist. I do know how to talk to a heritage planner. I do know how to talk to a transport planner. And there's some areas, transport, urban economics, I have a reasonable grasp. But I also know how to talk to people doing biodiversity and what's important to them. So that last part is actually about what's important. If you're going to speak to an expert, what do you need to know? So that's sort of the 3 parts of the book. And there's some other parts that I thought I would actually might read and touch on, but someone's got to tell me when to stop talking, because I won't.
That's me.
So there's a few things that I thought were really important. One of them is actually First Nations. When I've looked at, I critiqued all the capital city plans in Australia, and no one has really started to deal with it. Queensland a little bit in the southeast Queensland work, but people are really just saying up front, we acknowledge country, and then they get on and doing their plan. However, I know at the Commission, they started to really think about it, and I think each state is starting to really think about it. And the part that really gets me, and it was actually a friend of Brenda's who actually, Brenda's telling me we've got 3 minutes to go, that just means I've got 3 hours to go. That the part that really I find really interesting, and I always like to show it, and I was doing a guest lecture today and I like to show it, is I still can't get over how long Aboriginal people have been here. So the way I do it is, if you can hold your hand like that and face that way. If that's a timeline for how long Aboriginal people have been here, the top of Pranita's thumb is how long Europeans have been here. And that part really, really sort of gets to your head in terms of how do we learn that, which is what Nicole was talking about. How do we understand that in terms of understanding the landscape that we plan in? So that part I think is really important. And a quote that I have there is in 1789 they did a survey. And when they finished the survey in terms of a census, they found there was 859 people in Australia. You just have to go and it's an ABS stat. Whereas I did a lot of research in that space to try and find out, and a person called Smith, who I spoke to in Canberra, suggests that the best estimate, taking higher numbers and lower numbers, is there was 1 million people here at the time. So that, I think, is a part that's really important. One I put in cheekily when I announced all this on LinkedIn in terms of which city is better, and Sydney or Melbourne, and Liz Devlin, who was my boss, this was actually quite smart one day. I said to her, I'm a bit of a closet academic. She said, oh, no, there's no closet about it. When I've looked at the question of great cities, and I did that because in my book I started talking about great cities in terms of the initial title, and Peter Newman in Western Australia, who was one of the people who looked at it at the beginning, said, you haven't defined what a great city is. So I'd encourage anyone to read Sir Peter Hall's book, Cities and Civilization. That is an extraordinary understanding of what cities could be. There's a lot of people who've written, like Garvin's written about great places in terms of etc. But ultimately, my first boss, Jeff, was involved in a project at the City of Melbourne, and he got together every single metric about cities in the world of which were the best cities. And it was for the City of Melbourne at the time. And the City of Melbourne had they had a panel of sort of leading people for a whole different range of people. And he put it to them as to this, if you want to benchmark yourself as the best city in the world, this is how you measure yourself. And the panel basically uniformly said back to, what do people in Melbourne think? What's their definition of a great city? And I think that's really, really important. No city is the same, and we need to think about how cities are different. And you can't go into a city and try and put some view on it. You have to find out what I learned in Sydney, people in Western Sydney are not part of Sydney. If you don't get that, you're missing a point, a really important point. So that's a really important part when you're planning a place, to understand it from the perspective. So I'm actually running out of time, even though I was going to go through some of the points. So tell me if you want me to stop.
Yes, I think it would be nice to hear from the
So
panelists some questions.
I actually didn't get to the insights that I was going to talk about, but I think
Go to buy the book, Halvard.
there's copies over there that people can buy for today. So
there's a
goes up. Also,
discount
you can go
QR
to the
code.
QR code and buy it online. Both of them will give you a discount. So either way. But you see that they'll have to be pushed off the stage because I will.
Thank you, Halvard. I'd like to begin by asking our panelists with a question. Having had the chance to read the book, what wisdom does it contain that would have helped you when you graduated? Like, what wisdom would you like to give to our audience?
Thanks, Pranita. I'd just like to start by saying that it's a real privilege to be up here with Halvard and Henry talking about this book. As a recent graduate, it's been an incredibly useful resource for me. And so it's just great that it's been put together by someone who is as experienced as Halvard. So foundational to this book is the insights. It needs to be green on the...
Oh, sorry. So I guess I'd like to start by saying this book is founded on insights that Halvard has gained throughout his extensive experience in strategic planning. As a recent graduate, would have been a really good resource in terms of understanding what strategic planners do and the interesting work that they are involved in. I think the lessons learned and insights that are provided in this book are relevant to both graduates who are interested in city planning as well as practitioners who are involved in the shaping of cities. I'd also like to say that when reading this book, there are, as Halvard was explaining, there are some core components to it, and one of these is the 7-step strategic planning process. And I've had the privilege also of being involved in conversations with Halvard when he's been explaining this section of his book. As a graduate, I think it would have been an incredibly useful resource to explain exactly what strategic planners do in a really clear and concise way when planning for cities as well as urban areas. The book seeks to address a gap that I think still exists when practical courses relating exactly to strategic planning. And as a recent graduate, I can attest that a lot of what I've learned about strategic planning has been through my own practical experience, both in the private and public sectors. So yeah, I just think that there are so many useful insights that graduates would be able to get from this book. And one of those core elements is that 7-step strategic planning process.
Thank you. Thank you, Vera. Our next panelist, Henry, with your experience overseas, I think the question is very much, do you think Australian planners are equipped to work abroad, overseas, and what value would this book add to that process?
Yep. Can everyone hear? Yep. So in short, yes. In long, yes, but let me explain. So sort of as Associate Professor Halvard said, I think that's right, sorry, earlier, you can have all these ideas, but the key is having the idea in the local context. So my perception of planning is planners function as implementers of best practice in their context. So statutory planners, say at the more local level, you have your examples of best practice, might be from an LEP, DCP, all the way up to metropolitan planning documents, and then you help implement that into your DAs, into your local context. Strategic planners are a bit higher, a bit more higher in terms of scope, but then they're sort of looking further abroad, as Halvard said. He looked in his book at, it was London, New York, Toronto, and then another Canadian city, Vancouver. So strategic planners sort of look at that higher level and then go, okay, am I Greater Sydney, am I Randwick, am I a local neighbourhood? How can I take these learnings and implement them? And so then I think for planners working overseas, a lot of the best practice is the same, or at least analogous, but the issue is then the context. So take a big issue in Sydney, affordability. We have community housing providers and affordable housing contribution schemes. New York has also struggled with this issue, and they have the Housing Development Corporation and inclusionary zoning schemes. And the HDC, Housing Development Corporation, is basically a community housing provider. An affordable housing contribution scheme in Sydney is roughly similar to their inclusionary zoning scheme. But the differences between them is just how it's translated into the local context. And then sort of where I think Halvard's book is beneficial in people interested in moving overseas or working temporarily, permanently, either, is his book sort of sets that underlying thought process and that ability for you to not only identify the best practice and then also discern it and help build on it to then implement it into your local context. And then I think as Australians and Australian planners, or future planners for those still studying, is we have a very unique and diverse experience in Australia. So if you take Greater Sydney, for instance, you can have very expensive CBD developments. You can have, urban renewal of brownfield areas. You can have greenfield out on the urban fringe, city shaping infrastructure. So we do have access to these contexts, and overseas it might be slightly different, but at the high level it's still the same. And so I think Australian planners are very well positioned to work overseas because planning is universal in sort of the high level. It's drilling down, which is the hard part. But then if you have a high level, which is done through, a good undergraduate, good postgraduate degree, supported by academic literature, and then the only issue really remaining is that context. But, if you come from, I think 48.6% of Australians have at least one parent born overseas. So a lot of us have exposure to different cultural contexts. Like I'm half American. I'm sure many people here have at least one parent born overseas. So I think we have all the tools at our disposal. It is just getting out there and experiencing that context. And there's sort of a little saying, just conscious of time, I like to do is individually, people are unpredictable. If how is this household going to react to something? But a city full of people is predictably unpredictable. So you might have 50% of people go to a coffee shop to work and 50% of people stay at home if they're working from home. An individual person, you wouldn't know. But if you generalize it over a neighborhood, over a city, you can get a rough idea. So the issue of context, while I have talked about it as sort of the main barrier, is not really that much of an issue if you get out there and experience it, because we do have this experience from Australia, and then we also have this really good education, really good framework. So that's my opinion.
So I was saying that we'll begin with a graduate, a practicing planner, now a mentor and a trainer, who has probably trained a lot of our graduate planners. A very difficult question in planning in terms of, like, Halvard's book has shown us that there is technical expertise that we could give them in the classroom. However, the actual playing field of planning in the real world is quite complex, and it has, you've got to deal with a number of stakeholders, and what happens when the stakeholders are not ready to listen to your evidence-based informed advice. How would you advise a new planner to navigate this situation? Thank you.
Thanks. And whilst I've worked with a lot of planners, I'm very lucky that Halvard, as my mentor, has written down everything he's taught me over the last 10 years and put it in a book. I couldn't be happier. And that the actual answer is 42 would have made you would have really laughed the evening you added that number up. Look, it's interesting in that there's a lot to be gained from this, and how it's very systematically set out all the many parts. And I think one of the parts around strategic planning is that it's a process that you have to be prepared to do in the open, that you don't get to, if you've got a plan due in September and you're starting last September, you don't have up till August to work on it. You need to have pretty much got drafts circulating to different stakeholders in February, March. You've got to build the coalition of support. You've got all the different disciplines. And then once you're getting them on board, then you've got to get them all together. And that's when the magic happens, like pulling them all together. So to then get to your question around, if the issue of the day is not strategic planning, but housing, or for instance, in other times it's been jobs, like you could get anything up if it related to jobs, is to find what it is your hook in, because if there are other 42 things, find your hook in and frame things through that lens. So how do people get from these homes to jobs? So how's the transport system supporting jobs? What does it mean for the environment, what are our settlement patterns doing in dealing with resilience and climate change, because where we put the homes are important. So finding that way in, and it's, you know, it will come and go depending on the lens, but the thoroughness of what Halvard's done is, regardless of which way you need to go into this issue, you do need to systematically have covered off all those other elements one way or another.
I think the first step would be then to open the book and read it. Yeah. Buy the book first and open it and read it. Before I open up to the audience for questions, I'd like to ask Halvard a question which I think I should have asked you earlier, but I think what motivated you to write the book, and who was the audience? I think you sort of reflected on that before, but why should they read it? And yeah, what is the motivation? And yeah.
It's an interesting one in the sense of when I was wanting to do a master's, and I have a master's in project management, there wasn't a master's in something about the complexities of cities in terms of strategic planning and how you address it. And while there's some great books that talk about individual topics that we have to address, whether it's climate change, whether it's housing, whether it's sustainability, all those things, there's some great books that talk about that and cities. But how you put it all together. And I think also I've been driven by the desire that I think planning for cities can make a difference. And I think that, so in one of the book things I was going to touch on is that in the book I talk about, often planners think about, okay, we have some levers in planning, we have a regulatory lever in terms of zones, and we have some policies. That's true, but in my view, there's also 9 other levers that you can use. And it's understanding how we can intervene. And so therefore, for me, it was, we can make a difference by using all those levers. And an interesting thing is I read in a book, and one of the quotes about why I plan was actually done 2,500 years ago. Plato made the comment that any city, no matter how small, has 2 parts, the part for the poor and the part for the rich. And that hasn't changed. I was doing a guest lecture today, and if you look at the CIFA index for Sydney, the areas that are impacted in terms of that difference in opportunity, that's been around for 40 years. And I think that planning needs to try and be a bit careful in terms of how we help. As Stephanie said, sometimes you're in an environment where, okay, if you're not talking about housing, well, why are you in the room? So you've got to learn to do something different. I worked on a metropolitan plan, I won't say which one, because I've now been working on my 8th, that I wasn't allowed to use the word climate change, okay? But I was able to say, okay, so we should encourage to have lots of activities around train stations because the train stations will be more efficient. Oh yeah, you can say that. And so you could say a whole lot of things except for the word climate change. So I think we have to learn to understand that we need to change lots of things and how we do it. So through my career, it's been, I read a lot about complexity theory, which I think best understands how a city works. So I've tried to always try and understand, how do you change a city? Right now that I'm sort of coming to my point in my career where I'm trying to be more of an academic, but a teaching academic, not a researching academic, is how do you make change from the outside? How do you provide positive input to a narrative? Because when I first started planning, nearly next year, 40 years ago, the question of planning being on the front page was nearly a laughable question. Now we're on the front page all the time. It's how do we influence that? So that's what's actually driven me, the fact that there are 2 parts of a city. And my feeling, as Stephanie mentioned, is if we're going to make a difference, we have to do it in a very methodical way. We can't just go, okay, we've got some vision, we're going to try and make it happen. So putting that down on paper, I felt was very important because I recently had discussions with the former head of the commission, and we were talking about legacies, and plans aren't legacies. Legacies are what you pass on to the next group of people to actually take a leap off your shoulders. So it's for that reason I put the book together.
I work for the New South Wales Government at the Environment Protection Authority, and when we organised the 2017 Clean Air Summit, we weren't allowed to mention the word climate change, but now we're helping the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water organise the Global Nature Positive Summit, and climate change will come up a lot. Thank you.
We've also got some pre-sent questions.
Yeah, no, thanks, and yeah, thanks very much, Halvard, for your
It's run out
yeah,
of
yeah,
batteries
yeah.
again.
Thanks very much for your words. And this was almost one of your questions, Steph, as well, Halvard. But to journalists, it's pretty clear that they've got no idea what strategic planning is. And if you talk to most journalists, they think the planning exercise is about, frustrating housing supply would be the summary at the moment. Do you think, in terms of an audience, how do you get, some of the excellent ideas in your book across to the media that might provide a better platform for people understanding what strategic planning is? Because I think, probably not many planners understand it, but once you get past planning, it just seems like a bit of a black box for people.
I actually talked a little bit about that in my guest lecture today. I think one of the things we have to do is to learn how to communicate. And so, for example, my partner Brenda is in education, and I learnt that when she's at schools talking to children, if you say the word "don't run," the children hear one word, run. So when people talk about density done better, the community goes, density, that's a very bad swear word. So I don't care what you're talking about, it's bad. So as an example in terms of how we have to communicate, I was asked when we're doing the plan to go and speak to 11 North Shore mayors. And you sort of go, okay, that's going to be an interesting part. And they said, should we organise an ambulance before you already go? Because I was talking about housing targets. And so this is back 2017 or 2016. So I said, okay, so I walked into the room and sat down and said, look, before we start, can I just ask a question? Where do you want your children to live? And after that, they had no recourse in terms of ability to go back. So if we're going to talk to the community about why we need planning, we need to talk to the community about what resonates with people. And talking to people about where their children lives resonates, because very quickly you're talking about they can't afford a house, that they don't have a car, we need apartments beside a railway station. So there's no need to tell people that that's what you want, because people say, well, that's the government telling us something, I don't want it. But if you talk to people in a different way, I remember saying that to Tim Williams when he was at Committee for Sydney, that we have to use a language that helps bring the problem to life, and then talk in a way and be. We have to learn to be clearer, and it's not easy. That if we don't have levels of housing around stations, etc., we have to have more people down at Wilton. What we don't tell people is that those two things are linked. And we need to have better ways of saying that in a very plain English way, so that people themselves join the dots, and you don't have to tell. And when you join the dots, you could quietly say, well, that was actually strategic planning. But what you're telling them about how they live within a city. Some things people understand quite easily. If you have a factory and it's got smoke coming out, that's pollution, and we don't want that. So it's much harder to sort of talk to people about the question of apartments around the station. But if you talk to them about where their children will live, it's a very easy thing to do. So that, I always have another one in terms of, if you want to plan for housing in a city, and we sort of want to do that, the last thing you talk about is houses. And people sort of go, well, Halvard's gone, he needs a holiday. And I do, I'm actually going on holiday on Monday to France. So, but I'll put it to everyone here. It's probably not the case of everyone. There's probably a few students are living where they can live. But for most people who've got a house, that when you decided to live in that house, my feeling is the first thing you wanted to do was you found a place where you wanted to live. Close to family, close to jobs, close to work, close to parks, something. There was something that drove you to be in a place. You then go and look at a house you can't afford. That's my dad joke, get a few smiles. And then you go and look at a dwelling that you can afford. If it's in Oran Park, it's probably a detached house. But if it's in Paddington, it's probably an apartment. If you want to influence housing, go back to the first question. Why did you want to live there? And how do we make those elements better? How do we get more schools where we need them, better public transport, parks that are usable? If we influence those things, we influence housing. I remember when I was working in a council in Melbourne, it's a place called City of Casey, Catherine Kim country, for those who watch Fountain Lakes, as in Catherine Kim. The government said we have to have high density housing in all major centres. We were 50 kilometres out, and so I brought 4 of the biggest developers from Melbourne down to Fountain Gate and said, government said I have to have 20-storey buildings or how apartments here. And they said it back to me. They said, okay, I'll build one. But it's just a car park outside. So in the morning when people come down out of their apartment, they would just walk into a car park. Is that a great place to live? You make it a great place to live and we will come. So when we think about cities, it goes back to we have to think about what it is we're trying to do. So yes, houses are something we need to deliver, but that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make communities. And communities are made up of lots of different things. So that's what we should be trying to influence if we're trying to talk to the community about why we need to do something. That was one of my short answers.
You mentioned you were good at talking to ministers or politicians about planning. How can practitioners and those who work in government like myself sell the message to our overlords who sign off in our briefing notes that this is the right thing to do, this is the right approach, when for them it might not be politically tenable or they have zero idea?
Well, there's a couple of students in the room who I've talked, when we've done the Integrated Urbanism Studio, which Alice now is in charge of, there's a couple of things in terms of talking to ministers. And Stephanie can probably add to this as well, because she's done as much as I have. One is that how you present yourself is really important. You have to be confident. You have to be clear. When I was doing the earlier plan so I'll do this in a little bit of a roundabout way, the earlier plan for Sydney, a plan for growing Sydney in 2014, it has 22 objectives. I had to go around in the end and speak to not only all the ministers, but all the backbenchers covering the whole of Sydney and speak to them individually. But out of the 22 objectives, I only talked about 9. In that I only talked about the things that I knew they would need to understand in terms of, I'm telling them, these are the things that are going to be, that I'm really saying going to influence the city, and you need to be across those issues. They will assume I'm doing biodiversity. They will assume I'm doing certain things, and I don't need to talk to them about that, but I needed to tell them certain things. And it was a case at that time, I was talking to one of the Minister for Planning at the time about an outcome that was most likely politically difficult. So I had to indicate, because of a whole lot of transport reasons, and outline that, the risks of those transport reasons, and that I wasn't going to do something in that place, to make it very clear to them that that would be a political risk for them. So you have to make sure when you give advice, it's one thing to say the plan is to have 10 more houses in Chippendale, but you often have to say the risks of that. The risk of that is the proportion of open space will go down. And so you have to make sure that you tell them all of the things that could be a challenge. And as I say, and there's a couple of students here I know, got to do that in 10 minutes. Got to do it really quickly. And you have to know how your minister works. You have to know if they like plans, if they like a PowerPoint, and you have to know so you have to understand how to communicate. And the best way to teach people on that is you bring a person along. They have to see how you do it, so then they learn how to do it themselves. So communication, and hence in the subject I've been teaching with Alice this year, the students have to present 3 times, and we continue to say how you present is absolutely important. And so it's how you present, what you say, because the students have to present for 20 minutes. And I say, look, we don't present for 20 minutes. It's a 10-minute, really quick discussion. And you've got to get that message across. So my lesson to people would be, know what you need to say, and absolutely, what Minister Stokes was very clear in the public on this, tell me what is wrong. Don't think that I'm going to try and find that out myself. You have to say, this is a problem and this is how we're trying to fix it. So, because ministers, one thing I've learnt with ministers is, and so one other extra story which tells part of the problem. In Victoria, I did a plan where there was a challenge, immigration rates had changed, the amount of land supply we thought we had halved, and the government had a threshold. We were below the threshold, let alone delivering what was needed. And so we went to government and we were really quite nervous. We said, things have changed. You don't have the land supply that you thought you had and were publicly saying last year. And so we had to tell them exactly what the problem was. This is why immigration has changed, massively higher. Therefore, the annual take-up of land is so much faster. We don't have as much land. The beauty of talking to ministers, very frankly, is the Premier of the day at that point did a very long 30-minute speech to the property people. Talked in the beginning about all sorts of wonderful things about cities and planning, etc. Right in the middle, just very quickly said, and we don't have enough land, and then started saying all the things the government was going to do. No one remembered that middle sentence. So one of the things I've learnt with talking with politicians is they have a very good ability to tell your story, even if it's a bad story, out into the public. So therefore you need to tell them what is wrong, because the last thing they want is someone to ask a question. But Premier, isn't the case that you now have half the land you thought you did? So the Premier absolutely knew that. I remember I actually told the Premier face to face. So so that's what's really important when you talk with ministers. They have to know what's going on.
I actually haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but I plan to. So my question might be a bit abrupt. So this question is about how we can achieve better urban justice through strategic planning. Because the idea of a city division in two parts, poor and rich, right? So how can we achieve justice towards poor side? What is the role of strategic planning here, and to what extent you think the planning framework already equipped with this, and where we lack?
Okay. If you want to read in that area, there's a book by a lady called Susan Feinstein called A Just City. Absolutely well worth reading. I think the first part is the work that you do needs to acknowledge the difference. So in my guest lecture today, one of the things I showed was we absolutely tried to understand the question of opportunity and the differences in choices across Sydney. And I have about a dozen slides that try and show that difference. So I think the first thing, if you've done some good work, you have to be able to show again the minister, there is a difference in choice. And different governments in terms of persuasions use different language in terms of that choice. So you have to learn the language of the government, but both sides are always saying we have to improve people's choice and equity. So the harder part is to make a difference in that space. And to me, there's a number of elements. The first one is you have to be very close with transport, because part of the challenge is accessibility. But when you have areas that are low socioeconomic, and I've worked in a few, particularly in Melbourne, at a ground level, when you have entrenched disadvantage, the issues are not planning. What you have to be able to do is to engage with the people who do work in that space and say, how can we help? I worked on a project where in a suburb in Melbourne, which was the eighth most disadvantaged suburb in Australia, we managed to get the government and the council to agree not to do a 1-year project, but an 8-year project. And that project was probably one of the best projects I've done, in the sense of it's a mixture of community development with strategic planning. What you have to learn to do is to go at a different pace. And that's very hard to get governments around. Fortunately, we had a director of housing in the Victorian state government who knew that, who gave us the 8 years of funding. So you can work at a very slow pace. So that only occasionally occurs. And where we have situations now when it's all about housing, it's very difficult to get that on the agenda. And so it is one of those spaces that we still don't deal with correctly. Because as I said in today's lecture, the parts of Sydney that have from the CEFA index are disadvantaged, have been disadvantaged for 40 years. What the challenge is, I worked on a project with SGS many years ago in Victoria, where in a place called Lara, SGS managed to show the government to tread water in one suburb was going to cost $250 million. To take that community forward was going to cost $1 billion. And one of the challenges in planning, and this is for all of the graduates and Henry and others who's working overseas, we don't have a good ability to have urban models, not transport models, but urban models that show how we can influence cities. In my book, I talk about the fact that in Melbourne and Sydney, every year, $35 billion worth of investment happens, and it happens in the zones that we dedicate. Planning needs to take ownership of that, because at the moment, transport does. Transport takes ownership of that in their transport models. We have to take ownership of in urban models. I'm working with a PhD student in London at the moment, giving some advice on urban models in terms of the models are too simple for what the complexity of the city is. And I'm just providing input to that. We need to take ownership. If we can take ownership of that, we can then start to say, what is the benefit and economic benefit, because that's what Treasury will listen to, of us interfering in those spaces. So that's a part that I want to try and influence now that I'm not having to sort of work 9 to 5 at a flat out rate, which I actually stopped on Friday. So I can now want to change where I put my focus is to understand those and work with people like the guy in London as how we better understand and influence those outcomes, because it is the case we haven't done it much before. That was not the short answer.
Thank you, Halvard. I think
If I could just quickly tack on to the end. So for my undergraduate exchange, I went to 2 hours south of Chicago. But if you know US domestic history, Chicago is a very unequal city, and it has been since, great migrations north from the African American people. But sort of as Halvard was saying, taking ownership in every course I did over there, from data analysis, regional planning, economic planning, there was always an element of race and injustice in it. So I think it's sort of a bit more advanced maybe than some of what I've seen in Australia, but just taking ownership of the issue and then incorporating it. Going back to the start, what Halvard said actually at the start, not just going acknowledgement of country, here's the plan, going acknowledgement of what's happened and then including it throughout. I just wanted to add that.
I'll just add a quick bit on that too. I think it was interesting what Henry's just said, because Ed Blakely helped me do a study tour of North America, and I had about 30 meetings with people he knew. And one of them was I did a trip to Harlem with a lady, and she was talking to me about exactly what Henry's talking about in terms of their African American Baptist group, in terms of religious group, was so important in trying to deliver justice outcomes. And I'm sort of going, when I experienced it talking with this lady, it's okay, so it's something I've never experienced here in terms of that type of community having such an important role in influencing urban outcomes. And and then just and on doing that in terms of how you do it, I listened to a podcast, I think that the university ran here, and a lady from Johannesburg said, if we want to engage with people, we have to move at the speed of trust.
Thank you so much. I think we can go on throughout the night with the conversation.
I bought my sleeping bag.
If we don't have any other questions from the audience, any last words? I've got a few, last questions for our panelists. Having read the book, in your view, first Henry, Viva, and Stephanie, who do you think should read the book and why? Just a last quick.
I've spoken a bit, so I'll just take some of the easy answers first. Obviously, students, especially, graduate, undergraduate, or even if you have a friend in high school who's potentially interested in planning, because as many people, I came from liking geography in high school, but I remember my first plan, I think Halvard actually says in the book, I was drawing circles on a map. concentric city theory, but at the time it was just, pretty circles. But definitely anyone interested in planning as well as continuing. So I'll just take the low-hanging fruit.
I'd also just like to tack on to what Henry said. I feel like a lot of people I've spoken to, especially graduates, kind of say they fall into planning, and it's usually from a related discipline like architecture, or whether they're working in, civil engineering, something like that. So I think this book would be really useful for anyone who's interested in how cities work, whether they're thinking about pursuing it as a career or just a passion. I think it's a really great kind of overview of what strategic planners do and the work that they're involved in.
Yeah, I'd really like to pick up on the multidisciplinary part of the book, and I think there's a section in it that sort of breaks it into three parts: the people and place, the jobs and economy, and then the connections between. And so the people in transport who work actually in planning, the people doing, jobs growth and investment attraction that are actually working in planning, like to have this as a resource now that can be accessed across all the multidisciplinaries is really, that's who I want to see reading it.
Thanks so much, Renita, and thank you to Halvard, Stephanie, Viva, and Henry, and to you in the audience. I just want to say that I think you should read the book is Journalists in the Sydney Morning Herald, New South Wales Productivity Commission. We could add maybe the, Commonwealth Productivity Commission. We could throw in some, politicians. Peter could add. It's short, well, possibly short edition, but the summary edition. Well, that would help. That would help. Anyway, there's a lot of people, including you. If you haven't had a chance to pick it up, I've got to say the thing that I like the most is Halvard talks to you directly. So it is actually a really easy it is. It's an easy and interesting read, and I'm a tough critic. I like easy, interesting reads. So, there you go. There's my pitch. We have to draw a line. I know there's lots of questions. Halvard can go on all night. The great news is he's going to, because we've got a reception outside and we really want to see you all there to join us for, drinks and something to eat. There is actually another event happening at 6:00. If you can tear yourself away from discussion. It's the Tin Sheds Gallery's latest exhibition opening. It's called The Garden at the End of Time. So I'm definitely going to go in and check that out. And also keep an eye out for our latest events. The next one that the Henry Halloran Research Trust is part of is an event that we're co-hosting with the Sydney Environment Institute here, and it's called Centering Nature in the Transformation of Urban Spaces. And one of the headline speakers there will be Dr. Adrienne Keane in the back of the room. So that's going to be a great event. Watch out for that. But look, let's give a round of applause to Pranita, to Halvard, Stephanie, Viva, and Henry.